Hi, student. This is Scott, your instructor. I welcome you and I thank you for joining me in this course. I hope by now that you've purchased my book and you've had a chance to read the first few pages and that they have brought you here to this lecture. This lesson, Lesson 1, will be an introduction to the GRE, nth degree tutoring, and this class, which I call the GRE course you want. I'm going to start out by discussing the big picture. What is the GRE, and where does it come from? So GRE stands for Graduate Record Exam. Many students are completely new to the GRE, and honestly, most of my beginning students don't even know what GRE stands for. So if you're in that boat, you've already learned something. GRE stands for Graduate Record Exam because it is administered for all graduate and professional degrees except medical degrees. It is written and administered by the Educational Testing Service, abbreviated as ETS. The ETS has no affiliation with any university or test prep service. It's not associated, for example, with Magoosh or Manhattan Test Prep or Kaplan. And for that reason, none of those services, myself included, are able to actually use real GRE problems. The GRE was created in the 1930s. It's almost a century old now. And that history means a little bit something to me because the flavor of the exam really reflects its history over these last 9 decades. If you think about what graduate school was like in the 1930s, you're probably aware that it was an exception and not the rule. The graduate population at that time was very small. Furthermore, graduate school was much more academic at that time. It was not so vocational as it is today. It's essentially the graduate school of today is very much like the undergraduate school of the early 20th century. And at that time, standardized tests were mostly used at the upper levels, not so much for admission for mid-level schools, but particularly to identify candidates who showed strong promise as academics. So you might sometimes feel that this test has a funny flavor to it, a very academic flavor. But that basically is the reason why, because of the history of the exam, and the exam, quite honestly, is just progressing more slowly than the graduate population. But that's what it is, and I think that it's good to be aware of that. GRE Subjects and Scoring. So the GRE essentially covers what we used to call the 3 R's: readin', writin', and arithmetic. In GRE parlance, we call these the quantitative section or the math section, the verbal or reading section, and then the essay section. So let's start from the top and discuss the quantitative or math section and how it's scored and how it is basically designed. It's graded on a scale from 130 to 170. Therefore, if you split the difference, a score of 150 is right in the middle. And I don't know if you're aware of this, but most standardized exams are scaled in such a way that average scores have a 5 in them. For example, an average SAT score is 500, and an average GRE or LSAT score is 150. And then the standard deviations are usually 10 or 100 from there. It's very important to understand that the math section of the GRE is graded on a curve. And that basically makes it a competition, not a bar exam. So your performance on this test is not simply how you perform against the set of standards, it's really how you perform against everybody else who's taking the exam. That's why it's so hard to get really high scores on this test. So since this exam is designed so that the average student will score about 150 and will get approximately half the questions right, what is the average student? Well, it turns out that the average adult, graduate student, applicant, has a pretty limited mastery of mathematics. I've been teaching GRE math for years and years, and I can say with pretty high confidence that most adults who take this course and are getting ready for the GRE have a math level at approximately the 4th grade level. And what I mean by that is that for the average student, 4th grade math is pretty solidly in their pocket. They're usually able to do, the average student, for example, will know her multiplication tables pretty well and will be able to remember how to do long division and things like that by hand. But when I give the average student a proficiency test at the 5th grade level, it usually is a disaster. So, there's something there at that 5th grade level. I call it the 5th grade mountain. So that's basically where your average student is. You might feel that you're in the same boat too, and maybe you are worried. Most students who call me are very concerned that they are that one student in the world who's just way behind math, way behind everyone else on math. So it might comfort you to know that most of the people sitting around you and taking this test are at the 4th grade math level. After 4th grade, each grade level basically gets a little bit worse and worse, and there's pretty much no recall at all beyond 8th grade. And the GRE, the ETS, is aware of that. So they essentially write this exam at the middle school level. You're primarily going to be tested on content at the 4th to 8th grade level. I think that's a pretty fair way of characterizing it, at least for the average student. Okay, then there's the verbal or reading section. That section is also graded on a curve and on the same scale from 130 to 170, with 150 being at the average. Now, your average GRE student is much stronger with verbal skills than math skills. It's probably fair to say that the average student has about a 12th grade English level. So objectively, since the verbal exam is curved around a 12th grade level, it is actually a much harder exam than the math test. In other words, if you gave this exam to a gifted 5th or 6th grade student, a middle school student, they'd probably do pretty well on the math test, but would really, really struggle with the verbal test because it's just over their head at that age. So that might interest and surprise you as well. My stereotypical student, whom I sometimes call Stephanie the stereotypical student, is usually terrified of the math test. She thinks that, she basically always says the same thing. I've always struggled with math. So she's pretty sure that her math score is going to be way, way below her verbal score. And that's because I think she's expecting a straight, basically, bar exam. She's expecting to be tested against a set of basic standards. But as you can see here, that's not the case at all. Your verbal exam is going to be harder because your competition is stiffer at that level. So are you going to perform better on the math section or the verbal section? The answer is, we have no idea. No idea. Until you actually take the test. I know what you're thinking. You think you're going to bomb the math section and ace the verbal section. But we'll see what happens when you take your entrance diagnostic. But what normally happens is that the scores are pretty similar to each other. Or in fact, to be honest, my average entrance diagnostic is higher on math by a couple of points than verbal. So you just don't know how you're going to score until you take your entrance exam. Anyway, so when you add these two sections together, the math plus the verbal, you get a total that ranges from 260 to 340, with 300 being right in the middle. Now, what are graduate schools looking for? Most departments will probably want to see an upper half composite score, which is about 300. And they might also like to see you score in the upper quarter on either the math or the verbal section. depending on your program. If you're applying to a physics department, I'm sure they're going to want to see a very high math score. Whereas if you're applying to a journalism department, they'll want to see a higher verbal score. The most selective schools, which are, of course, most students' favorites, are going to be more selective than that. And they will usually expect their candidates to be in about the upper 1/8 of the curve before they'll even really take them seriously. So if you are applying to an Ivy League school or a UC, then you'll probably want to expect a composite score of about 320 before you have a strong chance of acceptance. The essays are graded separately from the math and verbal sections. They're graded on a scale from 0 to 6, and another important difference is that the essays are actually a bar exam. In other words, they are you'll be tested against a set of standards called the grading rubric. And on the essay, it doesn't matter how your neighbors do. It's not you against everyone else. It's you against fixed standards. So essentially what we have here is two competitions and a bar exam.